In the 20th century, a handful of cities became legendary. Art, culture, and life itself burned brighter there, flamed by a tolerance that allowed eroticism, permissiveness, and sin to flourish. And for a brief period after the First World War, the world's great metropolis of vice was Berlin. Its very name became synonymous with perversion, debauchery, and creativity. Berlin in the 1920s was the sex capital of Europe.
Falling in love again, never once a fool. What's a girl to do? Can't help it.
It looked like a normal downtown area of Central Europe until 5 o'clock. And then everything would begin to change utterly. Places that you hadn't noticed would turn into outrageous strip clubs. The basements of the restaurants would be homosexual or lesbian romper rooms and sex clubs. Berlin was what sexual daydreams wanted to be. You could find almost anything there, and maybe everything.
Berlin was the modern town for women around the world. It was a city that was filled with lesbian life. There was the idea that everywhere you went, you didn't have to hide what you were, you celebrated your life. They called it their Shangri-La by the Spree.
Berlin was the place to take a walk on the wild side. The edge city in the 20s, more than any other place in the world. Unlike France, unlike the United States, Berlin lost. Germany lost in the First World War. With that loss came a revolution that swept away an entire political order.
After the armistice, the guns went silent across Europe, but not in Berlin, where Germans were fighting Germans. News of the loss by the fatherland had come as a shock to Berliners. They had been told that they would be the victors. The old order had lied to them, and now the old order was gone. In its place came chaos. The streets of what was once a quiet, conservative town became free fire zones. The nationalists of the extreme right battling it out with the communists of the extreme left. And out of this struggle emerged a new democratic state, the Weimar Republic.
Everything was going upside down in Germany, and they never experienced a democracy. So I said, now that we have freedom, now we have a democracy, we should have no censorship. Not in the theater, not in literature, and not in the cinema.
With this new anything-goes attitude, Berlin overnight replaced Paris as the center of hedonism.
The end of censorship was quite extraordinary for the whole world. That's why people saw Berlin as the Babylon of the 20s.
Berlin had embraced this extraordinary experiment in permissiveness with total abandon.
Things that had been considered to be immoral, amoral, whatever, became irrelevant, and anything went.
With no censorship, the theaters of Berlin became exhibition halls for unashamed sensuality.
The one thing that tied the shows at the Metropole, the Apollo, the Halle Revue, the Klein Revues together was the presence of naked women. Any woman would do, whether single nudes, chorus lines, or pairs of erotic dancers.
Tanz, das war die fixe Idee. Dance was the rage of the moment in Berlin, both as an expression of the joy of life and a kind of death wish. It was the dance on the rim of the volcano. Everywhere there were dance floors.
All across the city, in smoky cellars and lavish night spots, sprung up hundreds of cabarets where songs, sex, and satire were mixed into a decadent brew.
There was a great sexual nuance to a lot of the dancing, of the sketches, of the everything, and it all leads into this feeling that Berlin is a very sinful city.
But there was more to Berlin than sin. With its superb orchestras, its hundreds of newspapers, its nearly 50 theaters, and some of the best scientific laboratories and universities in the world, Berlin was the place for anyone with ambition, talent, or hustle.
Berlin became a magnet that attracted the most important artists, architects, film directors, painters, writers of the era. They all came to Berlin to make careers and to try and contribute something, but they all found it irresistible.
For those fleeing the collapsed empires of Eastern Europe, Berlin was seen as a cosmopolitan haven, tolerant to outsiders. And joining this massive migration into the city were hundreds of thousands of Germans, escaping a stultifying provincialism sweeping the rest of the country.
Berlin was basically the fighting ground of politics through culture. Every intellectual was leftish. The whole political right wing, which basically came from Munich, did not play any role in the beginning. The whole town was in the hands of leftish ideas.
But outside Berlin, the right-wing nationalist movement was attracting scores of disillusioned Germans, including one obscure Austrian corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler. Hitler, like many of the right-wingers, hated this new Berlin, a city bursting with Bolsheviks, socialists, revolutionaries, Slavs, and Jews. One day, these Berliners would pay a high price for that hatred. But in the early 1920s, Berliners had more immediate concerns.
By 1922, inflation was spiraling wildly out of control. It got to the point where people would be paid in the morning and have suitcasefuls of banknotes, and they would have to then run to the shops because in the time between being paid and the time when they bought their goods, their food, the prices would have risen.
With virtually every currency in the world more valuable than the German mark, foreign tourists flocked into the city to take advantage of the cheapest sex on the continent.
You had tourists coming from all over the world. $10 in American money could buy you anything you wanted.
People were renting out their bodies, people that you wouldn't believe, like generals and their wives that couldn't have been terribly attractive, would engage in public sex in their living room if there was any Japanese, Turks, or Americans who would pay for it, who would pay $1 for it.
With entire life savings disappearing through hyperinflation and desperate for hard currency, middle-class Berliners transformed their homes into houses of pleasure for tourists.
There was one family that actually turned this into quite a high art form, if you like, from a pornographic point of view. They started a little club called Alefa, which is an acronym in German for Alles eine Familie, which really means all in the family. And this was run by mum, dad, and 2 daughters, but it developed into a club where every possible sexual taste was catered for.
Hausfraus became harlots, teenagers turned tricks, and Papa became a pimp.
When you have unemployed, you also have an increase in sex workers. But it wasn't just Berliners. It was tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of young boys and young girls who were coming to Berlin to participate in this hard currency sex traffic.
If you knew what to look for, you could find anything known to man in the sexual world was available on the streets of Berlin.
On any given night, as many as 100,000 prostitutes walked the streets or worked the sex clubs across the city.
There were all different whores with different kinds of makeup on the street. For instance, one was called Mutzi. Mutzis, who were prostitutes who hung out on just one street, Mutzstraße, and these were pregnant prostitutes. And this being Germany, instead of just having pregnant prostitutes together, they were strung out on the street according to how pregnant that they were, so limousines stopping there could choose exactly how pregnant they wanted their Mutzi. There were prostitutes who looked horrible, who had acid-scarred faces or hunchbacks or were lame or crippled. These were called grasshoppers. You had mother and daughter teams on one street that dressed exactly alike.
Here in Berlin, sex for sale offered every sort of perversion or fetishism imaginable. There was not a sexual appetite that could not be satisfied in this city.
There were clubs where lesbians liked to whip schoolboys, and you'd find military officers sitting there with painted children sitting on their laps. So a lot of it was play acting, but there were quite a lot of people who also indulged in it.
There's no doubt that Berlin in the 20s and 30s was thought of as the most decadent city. They talked about it as if there was something intrinsically bad about the swampland that it was built in. And even worse was what they called Berliner Luft, the Berliner air, which they thought contained a kind of alkaline toxin that made all the sexual perversities spring loose.
Das macht die Berliner Luft, 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 so mit ihrem holden Duft, Duft, Duft.
There are reviews called "It's in the Air," meaning it's in the Berlin air, the sexuality. And the Berliners even believed that the air contained something like amphetamine that kept them up all night and invigorated them for the morning commute.
Not only was sex in the air in the Berlin of the 20s, it was also on the air, celebrated in song by Berlin's favorite performer.
Almost everybody in Berlin had a radio receiver at home, and Claire Waldorf was everywhere.
Claire Waldorf, the saucy cabaret performer who sang about sex with raucous gusto, had become the darling of Berlin.
She was short. She was very stocky. She had wiry red hair that she couldn't do anything with. She had a very rasping voice. She was something like a symbol of the city. For men and women alike, they looked to her as a symbol of what the ideal Berlinerin should be.
Like seemingly all of the really creative Berliners, Claire Waldorf came from somewhere else.
She learned the Berlin dialect, which is a very broad, very particular dialect, and very humorous and very irreverent, a little bit like Cockney in London. And she was just adored by the Berliners.
Everybody in Berlin knew Claire Waldorf was the first official lesbian in Berlin, and she did not make a secret out of it. And she basically had tried to convince all women who were important in culture that to be a lesbian is quite a nice thing.
Claire Waldorf had her eye on a young chorus girl and sometime actress whose legs were already legendary among the demi-monde of Berlin. Soon her name would become equally famous. She was Marlene Dietrich.
Claire was already a star, and Marlene had no experience singing, so Claire trained her. Marlene copied a lot from Claire Waldorf, not just the style, the androgyny, the pants, the tuxedo, the cravat, the cigarettes, but even more. Many years later, Marlene admitted to director Billy Wilder in a just between us men kind of conversation, that Claire introduced her to lesbian love.
When it came to sex, Marlene Dietrich could be omnivorous. As long as she found them attractive, she couldn't care less if her lover was a man or a woman.
Dietrich was an omnipotent sexual figure, was known for giving the best oral sex around the world. She was an icon for gay women around the world at a time when there was no one else.
In the 20s, it became legitimate that women have their own fantasies, have their own ideas of sexual freedom, and for a wide part of the population, it was somewhat of a revolution.
And at the very forefront of that revolution was a performer who was able to shock even the most decadent of Berliners. If there was a sex goddess in Berlin in the 20s, it was the actress and dancer Anita Berber.
Nobody personifies more graphically the idea of decadent Berlin than Anita Berber. She burned the candle at both ends and also in the middle.
In Berlin, scandal and Anita Berber became synonymous. She was one of the earliest stars of German cinema, but she gained real notoriety for being one of the first to dance naked on a German stage.
Anita Berber was a perfect Berliner. Loved men, loved women, loved horses, had her little monkey, you know. I mean, that was the perfect prop for every Berliner was a monocle and a monkey.
On stage, her performances were notorious for their eroticism and sexuality. Off stage, she flaunted her bisexuality and her love of drugs and alcohol.
She was famous for her complete debauchery, and she was open about this. She celebrated it. She celebrated it in a way that very few women had ever done.
With her openly homosexual husband, she danced bizarre fantasias with titles like Suicide, Morphium, Madhouse. While some thought her performances were no more than erotic stripteases, serious critics praised her as a creative and passionate artist.
One of the places that she appeared at was called Das Weiße Maus. And the White Mouse was a small cabaret of 99 seats, very expensive, very elaborate. Frequently, Berber would be angered that someone drinking champagne was not paying attention or talking or making noise, and she would step off this little tiny stage and stood on a table and just drank champagne and urinated on the people who were talking and ignoring her, which they didn't after that.
Fueled by a potent concoction of cocaine, opium, and cognac, she became more and more outrageous, involved in more sex scandals, took more lovers, and turned to the occasional foray into prostitution to finance her ever-increasing alcohol and drug habit.
Her favorite drug was an equal mixture of chloroform and ether mixed in a bowl, and then a white rose would be swirled in it, and she would chew off the petals, which had an effect on her brain.
In a haunting painting, the Scarlet Whore of Babylon, as some called her, was captured for history, and none too soon, for she died shortly after at the age of 29, surrounded by statues of the Virgin Mary and empty morphine syringes.
Drugs were readily available in Berlin. Every variety of drug, morphine, cocaine, opium. The morphine and the cocaine you could probably get prescribed by your local doctor or pharmacist to alleviate sexual fatigue or, perk you up. Opium was widely available, and also drugs were used in sexual science. Sexual scientists were very interested in the effects of, for instance, morphine would have on the orgasmic rate of a lesbian. So there was a complete scientific culture.
Berlin had become the center of sexual experimentation. It also became the center of scientific research into sex, led by a pioneering doctor.
long before Kinsey or Masters and Johnson, there was one German who is credited with inventing the whole notion of sexology or sexual science. And this was a very funny character called Papa, or the Einstein of sex in Berlin. It was Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was a queer, Jewish, social democrat and a great liberal who really defined the liberal spirit of Berlin. It was said that Hirschfeld had only slept with one woman in his life, and that was the most glamorous and decadent, who was Anita Berber.
In 1919, Hirschfeld and Anita Berber appeared in a German silent film called Different from the Others. It's the story of a homosexual violinist who's being blackmailed. This was the first movie in history to portray homosexuality so openly and so sympathetically. The film ends with Magnus Hirschfeld pleading for the rights of homosexuals. The crusading doctor for sexual freedom was also the founder of the world's first institute devoted to the scientific study of sex.
He had an institute in the very center of Berlin that became something of a tourist attraction because it was a huge complex that had the biggest library on sexual matters and pornography ever assembled since the Romans. But most of all, he was remembered for having a museum. The museum was a collection of fantastic materials, of sexual machinery from the past, masturbation machines, chastity belts, of flagellation machines. The greatest collection of fetishism, of sexual artifacts from World War I and long before. And it was a good place to start learning about the underside of Berlin.
You could go and look at various fetish items. For example, he had these trousers that if you wore a trench coat, you could walk around Berlin. It looked like you had pants on because the lower parts of the trousers were there, but then you had nothing on above them, and you could flash this way. This was thought to be very titillating, very amusing. So it was this sort of thing you could see in the Institute for Sexual Research.
Unlike his fellow doctor in Vienna, Sigmund Freud, Hirschfeld advocated the radical notion that human sexuality could be studied without imposing moral judgments.
Hirschfeld's also credited with operations and surgeries of sex change and sexual rejuvenation. He had a clinic for people to be consulted about sexual problems.
Homosexuals, transvestites, and transsexuals streamed into his clinic for help and understanding. They also streamed into the city streets and clubs of Berlin, looking for love. For here, the love that dare not speak its name could be shouted out right across the city. From all across Europe, artists, writers, and intellectuals with homosexual leanings were drawn to this metropolis.
Berlin was unquestionably the most open gay city in the world. It attracted first W.H. Auden, the great British poet, and then his friend Christopher Isherwood. Auden came first, was interested in the gay scene there, and talked about Berlin being a bugger's paradise.
Christopher Isherwood, fed up with Cambridge and an England openly hostile to homosexuals, chose to move to Berlin. His novels about the wild side of life in the city and its cabarets were eventually turned into a hugely successful stage play and movie.
He was interested in the fact that these bars were all over town, but he liked the seedier ones, the working class neighborhood ones. He was taken to Cozy Corner, which he fell in love with. It was dark, the booze was free-flowing, there was entertainment, there was all kinds of stuff going on, and it felt just disrespectable enough to really appeal to him.
I saw a picture of the boys there, and they were very disappointing, I have to say. They looked like street punks, which is what they were.
But Berlin was not, as some said, just for boys. In the 1920s, the city saw a riotously open and promiscuous explosion of lesbianism.
The sex life for the lesbian woman in Berlin was so varied because there were no restrictions about who could go where and who could find what. So there were working class girls that had their camping parties. There were actresses and models and socialites who were in their special private bars.
It was fashionable to be lesbian. You never really knew who was a lesbian or not. And there were bisexuals. It was a time of great experimentation along cultural, political, and sexual lines. It was a mishmash. And because the authorities kept an eye on things, there was the lure of the forbidden.
There was a broad range of female types within the Sapphic culture. It wasn't just the plain old butch femme. You had this broad variation of women. And you had something called the sharper, who was the older, independent woman who knew all these languages and seduced young housewives and converted young schoolgirls. You had the garçon, who wore the little masculine haircut called the bubakov. You had a whole range of something that was called girl couture. These girls had their own clubs, they had their own dining establishments, they had their own political associations. Even the boring dykes had their own associations.
There were about 160 completely different lesbian and gay male nightclubs and lounges.
Unlike most cities, with their one red light district, Berlin's erotic clubs were scattered throughout the vast metropolis.
There was the El Dorado, where absolutely everybody in the place, the hat check girls, the waitresses, the barmaids, were all men. And it wasn't necessarily that they were actually getting up to anything. They were just experimenting. They're experimenting with their sexuality. They're experimenting with what it feels like to do this.
But Berlin's reputation as a hotbed for the new and risque was not just limited to its bars and bedrooms. In the 20s, the German silent cinema was producing masterpieces recognized as being among the most artistically daring in the world. And at its center was a Berlin-based film conglomerate known simply by its acronym, UFA.
Basically, there were two great film industries in the Western world, UFA and Hollywood. UFA was such a big company, they had a lot of great technicians. And people from America came over to study special effects, lighting, camera movement, and of course, actors, and to learn from them.
Although UFA technicians invented the technology for sound film, UFA had to import a German-speaking director from Hollywood to produce their first talkie. Blue Angel captured on screen that decadent eroticism that was Berlin. Blue Angel also catapulted Marlene Dietrich from a Berlin cabaret stage to the world stage and international stardom.
Well, Professor, how do you like me now?
The Blue Angel, as many other early sound films, was shot in two languages, in German and in English. In the American version, you don't see much of the Garterbelt. It's a heavy censored version. Even in 1930 there was more sex in German films and in Germany allowed than in America. And that's probably another reason why so many Americans came to Berlin.
Berlin at night turned into an enormous illicit playground for adults. And one of the largest and most popular places for flirtation was the Residenz Casino.
The Resi was another pleasure palace. that was specifically the pickup place. People would get numbered tables and seats and could telephone each other, complete strangers, to talk to each other, to meet somewhere, or to engage in some kind of randy conversation.
Besides offering a chance to engage in some dirty phone calls, the Resi offered a different technological device for the hedonistic pleasure of its customers.
Another thing the Resi had was these pneumatic tubes that ran through the restaurant or through the club. You could send little gifts to somebody at another table by putting them into the tube and then rocketing it across the room. And the club sold these items that you could send: a cigar clipper, a box of condoms, a little cocaine.
Hello? Hello?
But even more than that, it had a wine cloister where people would engage in sex.
Open public coupling was just one of the social taboos tolerated in the city.
One thing that also distinguished Berlin's sexuality from other kinds was the subject of humiliation. Humiliation, or degradation, is very important to attaching the notions of power to sexuality. In many cases, the power of women can hold over men.
Bizarre sexual fantasies of domination were turned into works of art by one of Berlin's oddest couples, Rudolf and Speedy Schlichter.
Berlin's most modern woman is Speedy Schlichter. And she was a young woman who came to Berlin to be a model and an actress. She appeared in 2 movies as a prostitute, and she met a decadent artist, Rudolf Schlichter, and changed his life forever.
While they would indulge in a wide variety of strange sexual experiments involving violence and death, all in the name of art, Rudolf Schlichter's particular passion focused on one piece of Speedy's attire.
He was drawn to the laced boot. So Speedy's laced boots are very much a part of his sexuality. He began to do millions of erotic drawings based on her, and also based on her laced boot.
While boots might have been Rudolf Schlichter's great obsession, he was also for a time devoted to a movement known as Dada, which mocked anything to do with authority. His good friend and fellow Dadaist was George Gross, a painter who captured perhaps more vividly than any other artist the depravity and disillusionment of life in Berlin.
George Gross was a social critic. You'll see bloated plutocrats pigging out at the table while right next door are emaciated prostitutes. It's this kind of juxtaposition of hedonism on the one hand and utter despair and poverty on the other that interested him.
He was asked, why do you draw all these people so ugly and mean and stuff? I mean, I walked down the street coming in here. The people looked okay. And my father is supposed to have said, yes, but I know what they're like underneath, inside. And that's what I show in the face. To me, it's just a way of showing, this is what goes on behind your fine facade.
Gross made no one look particularly attractive, but he took special pleasure in satirizing a little-known demagogue making noise in the southern city of Munich.
He was guilty of one of the first cartoons, really famous cartoons against Hitler, where he depicted Hitler, I think it was about 1922 or so, as this Wagnerian character with a bear fur on him and a spear.
For that cartoon, and many others to follow, George Gross was put on an enemies list by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party.
At one point, they raided his studio. He painted in an apron, and he came to the door in the apron, and they said, wo ist dieser Gross? Dieser Judensau. They called everybody a Jewish sow because they thought he was Jewish. He wasn't, but that's beside the point. And he just said, I don't know where he is. I just clean up here. I'm the handyman. Right? And another time, though, when he was away, they did get into his studio and turn it upside down. The Nazis declared him cultural Bolshevist #1.
And that label of a cultural Bolshevist would be used over and over again by a ruthlessly ambitious Nazi Party official named Joseph Goebbels. Hitler, eager to gain power over Germany, had personally appointed him to go to Berlin to win over the hearts and minds of its 4 million citizens. It looked at the time like an impossible mission.
When Goebbels got off the train in 1926 to take over the city, he found the Nazis could scrape together maybe 200 members. And the communists at that point had about 250,000 members and many other people that they could draw on for support.
It was he who was designated to turn the city from a bastion of communism, a red city, into a brown one, that is a bastion of the Nazis. This was a difficult proposition. Berlin to them was foreign territory. They shared the typical provincial conservative Germans' notion about Berlin as a decadent place, as a place that was filled with foreigners, with Jews. It was too cosmopolitan. It was too avant-garde. They hated the place.
Berliners actually rather liked their city as it was. They liked the cosmopolitanism, the modernism of the 1920s. And they didn't particularly take to a group of people who came in from outside and said that everything that the city had stood for was all of a sudden to be abandoned or to be considered decadent or to be pushed aside.
In 1928, a Nazi propaganda sheet denounced Berlin as a melting pot of everything that is evil. Prostitution, drinking houses, cinemas, Marxism, Jews, strippers, and Negroes dancing. And yet, there was one activity that virtually everyone in Berlin supported, and that was Nachtkultur. Berlin was at the center of the modern nudist movement. But even nudism had become political, dividing along party lines. There were communist nudist clubs and socialist clubs with reformers like Magnus Hirschfeld. And then there were the fascists, promoting Aryan racial purity through the idealized German body. While it might have seemed ironic that the short, club-footed Joseph Goebbels was in charge of promoting racial superiority, he never doubted his own ability to sell any Nazi propaganda.
He was a good choice for the Nazis because he understood the city. He understood you have to be violent. You've got to have thugs who can beat up the communists. You've got to have marching songs. You've got to have color. He understood, as he said, Berlin needs sensations like a fish needs water.
However alluring the siren song of the Nazis might have been to many of the German people, the vast majority of Berliners continued to stubbornly stand apart, unmoved and unconvinced. One day, in the late 20s, the Berlin commuters had something new to talk about. A bold, radical play that was almost immediately denounced by the Nazis had just opened. It was written by one of Berlin's most prominent bohemians and one of its most prominent communists.
Bertolt Brecht was very much a self-proclaimed proletariat. He wanted to represent the views of the working class of Berlin. He quite deliberately cultivated this look, so he always wore dirty clothes and he always had a sort of half-chewed, half-smoked cigar in his mouth, and he always had dirty fingernails and tried to cultivate the look of the proletariat. He, with Kurt Weill, who of course produced together the Three-Penny Opera.
It was 1928 when they collaborated on one of the most important and most successful musicals to ever open in Berlin. The Three-Penny Opera, filled with discontent and disillusionment, had captured on stage the essence of this sin city called Berlin.
This was on the one hand a very political piece because it was focusing on the poor people in Berlin who make their life with little crimes in the nightclubs, who don't care about the rules of society. And as well, on the other hand, it was exactly this motivation which gave them this erotic charm. So it was a kind of sexual revolution, but as well a political revolution, and all this in a marching kind of sound, women's freedom, proletarians' freedom. It was marching forward in his music.
But it was a music that was being slowly drowned out by a louder, more strident sound. Berlin was in an upheaval. Street fights were common. Unemployment was worsening. And then, on January 30th, 1933, Hitler, still unable to win the votes of a majority of Berliners, was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He made it clear what his plans for the city were. What is ugly in Berlin, we shall remove. And with the clicking of heels and the constant Heil Hitlers, it began.
What happened in 33, especially, was that the gay Berlin dive bars started to be raided. Those things were allowed to kind of exist under the radar for up until 1933, really. The Nazi police started paying attention to the dive bars. They were harassing the customers. They were closing them down. It became much more dangerous. You might get arrested or beaten up by the Nazis, which was very serious.
The El Dorado, home to some of the most famous transvestites in the city, was taken over and turned into Nazi headquarters. And in this city that prided itself on having more theater stages than New York and more newspapers than London, the arrival of the brown shirts would change all that.
The Nazis very, very quickly clamped down on all sorts of entertainment and all sorts of writing. The newspapers, there was no free press anymore. That's the first thing any dictatorship clamps down on. But there was no freedom to read books anymore.
And then, on May 6, 1933, at the urging of Joseph Goebbels, the Institute of Sexual Science, Magnus Hirschfeld's great dream of sexual knowledge, was raided. A few days later, his bust was hoisted on a spike and consigned to the flames. Along with his works, there were others whom the Nazis had decided were too decadent for their new Germany.
And Goebbels sang out the name of every book as it was consigned to the flames. Legend has it. Beware when they start to burn books, because tomorrow they will burn people, which of course is precisely what they did.
The exodus was almost immediate. Some of the best and brightest left Berlin and Germany. Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, George Gross, Albert Einstein, Marlene Dietrich, just a small number of the thousands who were driven into exile.
There is no doubt that something quite unique happened, something very special, a certain energy and a dynamism and a creativity and an openness to the world and to modernism and to new ideas that had not been seen in Berlin before that and hasn't been seen in Berlin since.
Berlin, for a short 14 years, had been a crucible of history, brimming with a volatile mix of sex, arts, and politics, laced with disillusionment and spiked with decadence. And although Berlin, the Babylon on the River Spree, was no more, other sin cities would emerge, bubbling with new ideas and old vices.